Well, hello, everyone. I'm Dennis Allan, a pastor at Garden City Church located in the north side of Pittsburgh. Welcome to Lenten Lunch. Today, we're going to spend a few minutes talking through a story that's found in the Gospel of John, chapter 3. It's the story of Nicodemus, one of the leaders of the Pharisees and a person that Jesus describes as Israel's teacher, coming to talk with Jesus. The story begins in verse 2. We're told he, Nicodemus, came to Jesus at night and said, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him." Now, there were three primary Jewish religious groups at the time of Jesus' public ministry: the Essenes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. The Pharisees were arguably the most influential and, interestingly, at least to me, the only group to believe in a Messiah who would come and inaugurate an era of world peace. It's interesting to me because Nicodemus, seeming to speak on behalf of the Pharisees, acknowledges to Jesus that the Pharisees know he is a teacher who has come from God. It's almost like Nicodemus is trying to determine if Jesus might just be the Messiah the Pharisees have been anticipating. Jesus replies to Nicodemus by saying these words in verse 3. "Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again." Jesus' reply appears to have nothing whatsoever to do with the conversation Nicodemus seems to want to have. It's almost as though Jesus knows that Israel's teacher isn't ready to know the truth. While Nicodemus and the Pharisees were anticipating the Messiah, they were anticipating a different kind of Messiah than the one Jesus came to be. And so it seems like Jesus may have been redirecting Nicodemus because he knew that Nicodemus and the rest of the Pharisees weren't prepared to understand and accept the true fullness and breadth of God's kingdom. We're told then that Nicodemus replies by asking a question. He says, "How can someone be born when they are old? Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born." And Jesus answers, "Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again." I love that Jesus says, "You should not be surprised at my saying." Jesus is using language that should have been familiar to Nicodemus. Jewish teachers, like Nicodemus, described Gentiles who converted to Judaism as newborn children who were born again. Jesus is looking at Nicodemus and saying, if you want to see and enter the kingdom of God, then your heart needs to be converted to a new way of believing. But to Nicodemus, it wouldn't make sense that someone who was already Jewish, already a leader of God's chosen people, would need to convert in order to enter the kingdom of God. Nicodemus assumed that his religious knowledge and affiliation were already sufficient to see and enter the kingdom. He thought he was already following God correctly. But Jesus was inviting Nicodemus to recognize that seeing and entering the kingdom of God wasn't based on having the right religious pedigree or theological education or political affiliation. Jesus wanted Nicodemus to know that in order for him to see and enter the kingdom, he needed to be willing to give up his particular way of believing in God in order to pursue a kind of relationship with God that produced continual renewal. Nicodemus needed to start fresh. He needed to be born again. And this is where I want to settle our conversation. Because this Lent, I think Jesus might be inviting some of us to start fresh and to be born again, to reconsider how we go about following God and whether or not it's aligned with the gospel. And to do this, we need to allow ourselves to be brought low, to be humbled, so that we can hear God's voice as he speaks renewal into our hearts. Many of us enter this Lenten season the way Nicodemus entered his conversation with Jesus. we're convinced we already know everything that we need to know about how to live and love like Jesus. That our way of understanding God is not to be questioned. That our correct theological thinking and right religious affiliation and socially conservative lifestyle is everything we need to see and enter the kingdom of God. But what if it isn't? Nicodemus couldn't understand why someone like him would need to experience rebirth. I think some of us can't understand why we need to experience renewal. In the third verse of the hymn, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," we sing the words, "Bind my wandering heart to Thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love." We're prone to wander. We're prone to leave the God that we love. We're prone to misunderstand the gospel. We're prone to cling too strongly to our culturally situated interpretations of the Bible. We're prone to mistakenly exchange the ways and character of Jesus for the ways and character of our American culture. God knows that we're human. He knows that we're frail. He knows that we're prone to dedicate our lives to thinking and believing and living in certain ways that we truly believe are good and right and just, only to realize we were wrong. This is why we need seasons like Lent. We need seasons where we can intentionally practice self-discipline and self-control in order to pare back our lives to the bare essentials and hear God as He calls us back to Himself. We need seasons where we reflect on God and see the ways we've unintentionally wandered from Him. Lent creates the space for our hearts to be renewed. Nicodemus could only discover who Jesus really was if he was willing to humble himself and accept that he might need to be born again and start fresh. My hope is that we too might practice humility, that we too might be willing to start fresh and have our hearts renewed so that we might be more fully conformed to the image and likeness of Jesus, that we might be willing to lay down our sense of biblical and theological certainty and listen to the voice of Jesus as He teaches us what it means to be His children who live and love like Him. And might we allow ourselves to be softened so that we can be increasingly known for our love, grace, mercy, and generosity.